Despite its name, the Final Fantasy series is expansive, with 16 mainline entries over the past 40 years, some with direct sequels that either act as epilogues and fill in plot holes, or take place years later and just expand the lore of the world and characters. There's also the ever-expanding universe of Final Fantasy XIV, as well as countless mobile game cash-ins of varying quality, some of which were killed just as quickly as they launched. It should be no surprise then, given the series' popularity, that it's also spawned numerous spin-off titles on just about every system to exist. So let's look at some of those. Well, most of them, actually.
This video is brought to you by Hollywood Squarespace, the only website generation service dedicated to remembering classic, celebrity-driven game shows. Sign up now to choose between a variety of templates for creating your own Hollywood Square fan sites, and nothing else. For a limited time, thanks to our collaboration with Square Enix, you can even create your own Hollywood Squares episode lineup featuring classic Final Fantasy characters from across the series' history. Learn more at hollywoodsquarespace.fake. Once again, that's hollywoodsquarespace.fake.
My goal with this list is to cover everything that isn't a mainline sequel, mobile game, or modern entry, as in something on current-gen systems, either as a new game or remake. So yeah, sorry Crisis Core fans, just go play that game. You don't need me to promote it for you. I'm gonna loosely organize them all too, so we're starting with a section I'm calling games that are kind of tied to mainline entries, but not really. So I came up with the idea for this list after playing like 100 hours of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, so it's only fitting that we start with the one game on this list that's literally a numbered spinoff. But while it seems like I'm already breaking my own rules, hear me out. It does feature some characters from Final Fantasy VII, but it stars an optional party member who's technically completely missable, so you might not even know he's from that game, aside from, being a numbered title. It's also a third-person shooter, so it's about as far from the source material as could be. That's right, we're kicking off this list with the divisive PS2 title, Dirge of Cerberus. This game is kind of a prequel-sequel that does a decent job filling in Vincent's mysterious backstory, even if it's way too overcomplicated in the same way that everything in the Final Fantasy VII universe is, but it also takes place 3 years after Final Fantasy VII, with Vincent teamed up with the rest of that cast in the aftermath of saving the world from Sephiroth and the Meteor, spoilers, though the rest of the characters are barely seen. It does feature some epic movie-quality cutscenes, which is fitting since this came out around the same time as Advent Children, the actual Final Fantasy VII sequel movie. And the game itself looks good for a PS2 title, though it's easy to forget that after 10 minutes of beautiful cutscenes, and then into the gameplay, it's a little bit of a jarring transition. While it looks good, the issue is just in how the game plays. It's a third-person action shooter with light platforming, but the controls are just all wrong by default. Reload is R2 and shoot is R1, which is flipped on its own, and then there's both a pause button and a menu button, which makes me wonder why the two options on the pause menu aren't just put with the menu that's like on triangle, and then let that menu be something more useful, especially considering how much is awkwardly mapped to the D-pad since those are the only buttons left. That all said, there's a generous control mapping menu that fixed most of my issues, but even then, the actual control mapper shows more options available that are unmapped by default. It's so weird, you have to go into this menu to fix the way the game controls, but even with the controls fixed, it doesn't feel great to play. It's like anytime your gun is out, the entire world pivots on its aiming reticle. Like that movie Hardcore Henry, but in third person, so it just feels awkward to get around. Especially with how small some of the rooms are you have to navigate. I think some of this would be fixed if the game was first person, but I guess then we wouldn't get to see Vincent's extravagant glory. A key selling point to the edgelords that played this as kids. Like me, actually. If I had hair, I would have parted it over one eye, probably. Then again, the camera is even worse when it's zoomed in for sniper mode, so maybe it's just bad regardless of being first or third person. I don't know. I'm biased because despite all the issues, I still genuinely enjoy the game. It's got a level of early 2000s jank that speaks to me, like a lot of games did back then before technology could keep up with the ideas. I'd honestly love to see a remake of it that improves the mechanics and lets the charm of the game shine through. And considering how heavily this game features the Deep Ground, which was also just kind of reintroduced in Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's possible that it's in the works, similar to what they did with Crisis Core. Though, I guess Deep Ground has appeared in other Final Fantasy VII Universe products, so it's not specifically a hint at Dirge. But yeah, this is one of my favorite bad games, and I'm not ashamed to admit it. So for a while they were pushing this whole Final Fantasy XIII universe. And this is kind of a weird game that originally started in that universe before morphing into its own game. Kind of like how Final Fantasy XV shifted from Versus 13. But this one started life as a PSP game that was Japan only, and finally came out in English on PS4 as an HD remaster. The remaster is inconsistent at best and looks pretty rough a lot of the time, but it is notable for being the actual first Final Fantasy title rated M, even before Final Fantasy XVI came in swinging with its edgy content. And it's actually a lot like 16, just much smaller scale due to limited hardware, and instead of following one main character, it actually follows a group of powerful students that get caught up in the Magitech War. But the more serious war-torn tone is still here, and the combat isn't dissimilar. It's action-focused with different moves mapped to the face buttons, and each character has the ability to summon an Eidolon, and taking control of these massive summon monsters is pretty awesome. Even if the game itself is just okay, and plays pretty janky thanks to still working off of limited PSP buttons. You can control the camera now, but it still flies all over the place because it's meant to be auto-controlled. I wish the combat felt better. Even on easy, it's chunky and moves don't always register, and having both dodge and an ability on the circle button feels like a mistake when so many buttons are unused, but this is still one of the more obscure titles out there that deserves some screen time. Honestly, anytime you can play as the summons, I'm on board. Okay, just to get them out of the way, this next section is the spin-off games I didn't really know how to categorize with anything else. They're each unique in their own ways, so I guess this category is just uncategorized. We're starting off this section with a loose pair of spin-offs. Obviously, seeing a Mario sports game title, you don't immediately jump to Final Fantasy spin-off. But I'm basically covering every game where Final Fantasy characters are playable, and both of these games are developed by Square and feature some iconic unlockable characters to play as. They're also just surprisingly good, deep sports games that deserve more recognition. I've spent a lot more time with Mario Hoops, and while it's a little tough to control, especially on an emulator, the controls themselves work surprisingly well, as you tap the touchscreen to dribble and swipe to pass or shoot. And each character also has a special move they can use to score extra points on a goal. And putting together a team of Final Fantasy characters and dunking on Mario and friends is just as satisfying as most of these other spin-offs, so I don't want to hear anyone say these games don't count. Mario Sports Mix takes it a bit further as the same characters are unlockable, plus Slime from Dragon Quest as an homage to Fortune Street, I guess. But there's 3 more sports to play along with basketball, and the main campaign tournament mode has the players completing each sport to earn a very Final Fantasy looking crystal that represents a trophy. And once they've collected all 4 sports crystals, there's an actual boss fight against a behemoth. It's the kind of ridiculous crossover you can only get from Square making a Mario sports game, and I love it. This might be the least Final Fantasy of any spin-off on the list, but it's still more than worth recognition. So I'll admit, it's not a very good game, but growing up, I remember liking this one more than the average person. But I also didn't really know Final Fantasy back then. It was created as an attempt to get more Americans into RPGs by dumbing down everything actual RPG fans love about the genre. I'm not kidding, that was actually their plan. They thought Americans were too dumb to appreciate RPGs, and that's why they weren't selling well over here. Which, like, fair, we are dumb, but you don't say the quiet part out loud, Square. So, as a result, while Japan was getting the properly numbered mainline Final Fantasy entries on the SNES, we got this. There's no proper party system, no equipment to manage aside from swapping your active weapon based on the situation, no random encounters, and no real challenge throughout the short and uninspired story. So why did I like it as a dumb American kid? Well, for one, I hadn't played many other RPGs yet back then, which I guess means it did its job in getting me interested in them, but also it actually has some really fun dungeon exploration. In lieu of grinding out random battles and telling an engaging story, this game instead is pretty linear and introduces some Zelda-like dungeon mechanics, where you get new gadgets throughout the game, like a grappling hook to cross gaps, and an axe to cut down trees in your path. It's all pretty shallow still, but I did enjoy actually exploring the areas more than I do in most classic Final Fantasy games. And maybe this is a controversial opinion, but constant random battles get old after a while. That's part of why I love Golden Sun, because during puzzle rooms they stop battles from happening so you can just focus on the puzzle, and so it kind of breaks up between puzzle stuff and combat stuff. I also like games where you can see the enemies on screen and avoid them if you don't feel like fighting. So yeah, some of the American novelties in this game are enjoyable. Sorry I'm a peasant. Also, while the story is a very simple crystal fetch quest, the script can be pretty funny, and I do like the added detail in battle of enemies showing visible damage as you weaken them, though pretty much every other graphical asset and animation is extremely simplistic and boring. But it's something. There's also no proper world map, and there's these obnoxious battlegrounds between areas that are just a series of the same repetitive and easy battles, even if the rewards can sometimes be worth it. But with all that in mind, this is a baby game for babies, and I can't recommend it to anyone over the age of 12, especially now that there's much better options. When I was a kid emulating Super Nintendo games because I was too poor to buy anything new on the N64, yeah, it had some merit. This 3DS game I can really only describe as Final Fantasy Monster Hunter, which is ironic because I love this game, but I don't care for Monster Hunter. But I love this one largely for the multiplayer, which I know Monster Hunter has too, I just don't like it. I had a super fun time with my friends playing through a good chunk of this game a few years ago. But yeah, it follows the same basic structure as the Monster Hunter series. You go on missions through a few rooms full of minions and like some treasure and stuff, and then reach a boss monster to take out that has special attack patterns to avoid and weaknesses to exploit. But in this case, the bosses are almost all classic summon monsters, reimagined in really cool ways. I especially love the cat-like Ramu. It's a bold departure. What? It's a bold departure, but way more interesting than just some old white guy. I see enough of those on a daily basis. Give me more cats. But yeah, between missions, you use the materials you collected to craft new gear and unlock new jobs, which kind of act like the weapon specialization system in Monster Hunter, but with a lot more utility, I think. Each job has quite a few abilities that can be mapped to quick action buttons, and each of these abilities can be upgraded, which basically acts as the level up system for this game. There's also a lot of customization for these loadouts, as you can pull abilities from other jobs too. They just won't be as strong as your active job abilities, which you can continue upgrading while that job is active. There's some additional mechanics too, like a crystal surge ability when you fill up a meter, which is different for each job, and the ability to briefly transform into iconic characters from mainline entries. It's a novel way to shoehorn in classic heroes, even if it ultimately feels like a novelty. The game admittedly isn't as fun solo, and considering 3DS servers have been shut down, there might not be much mileage to be gained from playing these days. Plus, the game definitely gets repetitive, which is also true of the Monster Hunter inspiration. But it's worth checking out at least, especially if you can find a way to do 3DS netplay emulation using a certain defunct emulator. Yeah, I said it. Suck it, Nintendo. I'm not afraid of you. Well, that was weird, but anyway. Next up is a collection of all the spin-offs specifically in the Chocobo series, but we have to start this section with a slight detour to a different kind of spin-off. Itadaki Street, also known as Fortune Street in English, is a long-running virtual board game series that has seen all of one entry in the United States, the aptly named Fortune Street for the Wii, which featured an odd crossover of Mario and Dragon Quest characters battling it out in what is essentially fancy digital Monopoly. By the time this came out, the series was already well established in Japan, though, going all the way back to the original Famicom, where it used original characters and a fairly simplistic presentation. After a few titles like this, the series evolved on the PS2, with a special entry that featured a crossover of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy characters for the first time. The gameplay of this entry stayed pretty much like the others. Characters move around the board buying up properties, and invest money into them to raise the price others have to pay if they land on them. And while moving around the board, they collect a series of 4 suit cards before going back to the bank for a large payout that can be used to invest in more properties, buy stocks in each district to raise your overall score, etc. It's kind of a dense game to explain and not terribly exciting from, an outsider who's not playing it. But the appeal came from not just the characters themselves, but the way these recognizable properties mixed up the gameplay. It's not a full party game like Mario Party, but Fortune Street does still feature a few mini-games at the casino square. And for this version, they were all swapped out with more recognizable options, like Chocobo Racing and a few different item search games. All of the boards are also themed around iconic landscapes, with my personal favorite being the Gold Saucer. This game feels like something you'd actually be able to play at the Gold Saucer. Add in a series of guest characters you can summon based on certain, chance card pulls, and some other fun series callbacks, and you have, admittedly, still a bit of a cash grab facelift for a classic series, but one that's got a lot of personality and that put the series on the map for a lot of people. Obviously, the Mario-branded Fortune Street game we actually got over here is the most recognizable one, though still obscure in the grand scheme of Mario games. But it's still cool to revisit some of these other entries in the series through fan-translated patches, even if they're not full translations and missing some of the personality. The last entry in this series, in general, was released in 2017 to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, and I really hoped after such a long hiatus they'd release that one in English, at least for the PS4, since the Vita has long since been dead, especially by that point. But considering it's been 7 years now, I think I can put that hope to rest. And it's also the hardest one to get the English patch working for, so I still haven't played it, sadly. One of these days, hopefully there'll be an easier way to patch that and I can actually play it. Not that it's that different from other Fortune Street games. They're all pretty similar, but still. This game is what required me to preface with Fortune Street because it's somewhat similar, and I wanted to have that baseline established already. This is also the game that made me actually want to do this list in the first place, because I'd never heard of it, and when I researched what it was, I went down the rabbit hole on other lesser-known Final Fantasy spin-off games. A lot of them I already knew about and have covered in past videos, but this one I needed an excuse to check out. So I made this video. While it's a virtual board game like Fortune Street, it's also exclusively Final Fantasy characters and follows the lore of the other Chocobo spin-off titles that we'll cover in this section, as Chocobo and his friends have a nice hang outside and get randomly teleported to a new land where they have to, defend against the attacking forces by playing against them in a Monopoly-style board game. That old chestnut. Because it's a GBA game, it's more focused on a surprisingly well-told single-player campaign, similar to the Mario Party game for GBA. Whereas the content of most Fortune Street games just have you completing each board in order to unlock new content to play in multiplayer. Chocobo Land seems really complicated up front, with a daunting amount of tutorial screens to read through, but Honestly, once you jump in, it's not bad to learn, and every new thing that happens takes you straight to the tutorial for that thing, so you don't have to read it all up front. They do a good job of easing the player in. The overall goal and structure is just like Fortune Street though, with each board having a value limit to reach, and once you reach that threshold and get back to the bank, or like home square in this case, you win. Each turn consists of rolling a die, deciding which way to move, and then when you reach a space, either buying it, upgrading it, or paying rent if your opponent owns it. The wrinkle here is the spaces have to be reserved with allies you purchase at shops, so you need to make sure you've got a good stock of allies to place on every spot, especially if you want to buy out an opponent's spot, because you have to place multiple of your allies in order to overpower the enemies. And each ally has its own power level and special ability, so you want to make sure you're planning out the board well too. It's a really neat mechanic that I prefer over just buying stocks and dumping money into spaces that otherwise don't really mean anything. This game also features a magic system where if you have magicite in your inventory, you can use it on certain spots to stop their effects for a round, or use it on an opponent to put them to sleep for a round, for example. There's a surprising amount of depth here for a little single-player board game on the Game Boy Advance. I'm really glad I know about it now, and hope you're curious to check it out too. I think it'd be awesome to have like a modernized version with online multiplayer, because as much as I love Fortune Street, I think this has more interesting mechanics. So there's technically two of these on the PS1, and I actually played this second Mystery Dungeon game because it didn't seem like the first one made it into English, and from what I know about similar Mystery Dungeon games, these two aren't that different from each other. I'm also just not the biggest fan of the Mystery Dungeon series, so I didn't want to devote too much time to these. That said, this one isn't bad. In general, I just miss this era of games with quirky little isometric 3D maps and rendered sprites, and then much more detailed pre-rendered cutscenes that look so much better than the rest of the game, but like help your mind fill in some of the missing details, and also there's just still a charm to all of it as it goes back and forth between the art styles. Anyway, this game kind of just throws you in as if you played the last one, even though we never got it, so that's weird. There's minimal tutorializing and a lot of item pickups and things that the game doesn't even teach you about, but it can be fun to discover things just by using them. But outside of the strange pacing, there's something weirdly addictive to the loop, where I found myself just going one more floor, even though the whole gameplay is just uncovering a randomized map, gathering a lot of the same items like potions, skill cards, and magic books, and using those items to attack enemies that keep popping up. It's very repetitive, but I guess it's like the origin of roguelike games, where the fun comes from the floor layouts and enemy placements being different every time. It's not usually my thing, but I was more engaged by it than expected. And I really love the art style. PlayStation 1 was something special, you know? I'm over the super clean, like HD 2D aesthetic. Let's bring back this chunky isometric style, like Breath of Fire 4, for example. And then here we've got a more modern take on the Mystery Dungeon concept, but I really didn't care for this one. It tries to evolve the idea, I guess, with a ton more story and voice-acted character moments, but there's just so much story front-loaded that it feels like the opposite of the PS1 title, where instead of no tutorializing, it explains every aspect of the game in excruciating detail to the point where I just wanted to be left alone to explore some dungeons. But those dungeons also aren't as interesting, and the art style loses a lot of its charm with the fully 3D chibi graphics, even if it does still also feature nicer looking pre-rendered cutscenes. It's all just a little too polished and cute. I definitely preferred the style of the PS1 games. This one also returns to the turn-based combat of apparently the first Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, and most every other Mystery Dungeon games I've heard of, admittedly, as opposed to the free roam attacking of Mystery Dungeon 2 on PS1. And frankly, I preferred how fast-paced that felt over this one. There's some semblance of depth here, with a job system and new abilities to learn with level ups, but I don't know. It's already hard to sell me on a Mystery Dungeon game, and then they went and simplified it too, while also focusing on a story revolving around memory dungeons inside people's minds, and a magical baby, which, like, I hate kids. That's definitely not going to hook me. Next is another quirky game starring Chocobo, but this DS title seems to be directly connected to the previous Wii game, with both using the Chocobo Fables branding. Only this one is played exclusively with the touchscreen like mini DS games. And the gameplay is about as far removed from the Mystery Dungeon series as you can get, which to me is a good thing. It's still top-down and 3D, but most of the action takes place in really uniquely rendered storybook minigames. I love these different art styles employed throughout the game. They shine on the limited DS hardware, even if the game itself is pretty simple graphically. You can also collect cards throughout the game that can be used in pop-up duels, which are neat little papercraft card battles against mostly Final Fantasy boss monsters. Add to that the charm of the storybooks themselves, with classic Final Fantasy characters thrown into even more classic Aesop fables and Grimm fairy tales, and you have a charming but simple game for all ages. Though it definitely seems to skew younger. All of the Chocobo games seem catered to younger gamers, honestly. But this and Mystic Quest are good entry points into Final Fantasy lore for younger gamers. Better than starting with Final Fantasy VII like me and being blindsided by the more fantasy elements later. This is a very simple racing game with a limited number of racetracks, but what it lacks in content it makes up for with charm. It features a lot of the iconic characters from the Chocobo series, up to this point, rendered in that cutesy art style of Chocobo Mystery Dungeon. It's definitely the most adorable behemoth I've ever seen in the series. I also love the presentation of the fairly basic story mode, where storybook scenes play out between races. It's lightly animated with a papercraft style similar to the Chocobo Fables game, but the dialogue has a lot of personality and fun meta comments. I especially love Mog. I just think his personality in the Chocobo series is extra fun, especially compared to how awful he is in Rebirth. Look at this horror show. Anyway, the races are visually interesting and control tightly, even if the opponents are extra hard and require perfect racing to beat them. But the addition of magic spell pickups and unique abilities the racers can unlock when they fill a meter really keeps things fun. It's actually really similar to how the Chocobo races work in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, funny enough. And not to brag, but I'm pretty good at those. Next up, we've got one of the more high-profile sub-series, for Nintendo at least, the Crystal Chronicles games, though some of you might not even know it's a series if you've only heard of the GameCube original. This first Crystal Chronicles game is a classic, but I almost didn't include it because it received a modern remaster. But that one was so bad that I still wanted to spend a little time explaining the uniqueness of this GameCube original, and also kind of establish the starting point for the rest of the series. It was one of just a few games that took advantage of the GBA to GameCube link cable, where you could basically use the GBA as a controller with its own screen. Seemingly an early prototype of the Wii U gamepad, except you can have up to 4 at once plugged in. I'll admit, there is a novelty to the concept of a multiplayer console RPG where each person can manage their own loadouts on the fly without pausing the game, but it also feels like there could have been a better way to do this without requiring players to all bring their own GBAs and link cables. Essentially, the action happens on the main screen while the controls come from the GBA's limited number of buttons. It's unconventional to say the least, and I think I can remember maybe one time where I actually got a 4-player game going as a kid, probably at a birthday party. Most of the time was 1 or maybe 2 players with my brother. And playing the game alone is honestly fine, since your customized Mog can carry the Miasma Chalice for you to avoid damage, whereas in multiplayer, another player is expected to carry it at all times, making it super not fun for the Chalice wielder, while everyone else is killing enemies and collecting the resources needed to craft better gear. Yeah, if you couldn't tell, I'm not doing a super deep dive on this one. There's a lot of mechanics and weird things that I don't really have the time to cover. But this game does establish some of the tonal Crystal Chronicle branding for future titles, such as the weird different races of this world. Ukes are primarily magic users, Lilties are little warriors, Selkies are the quick and nimble ranger types, and Klavets are essentially the well-rounded humans. It also establishes magic as consumable orbs, which are thrown and can be combined by multiple characters for more powerful versions. Basically, if you want to cast something higher than the level 1 version of a spell, you have to use teamwork and time the spellcast, which can be hit or miss if your friends are dicks or just bad at syncing attacks. Otherwise, the game just alternates between missions at various key locations on the map, fighting enemies, and opening treasure chests, and then going back to town to turn in your goods and craft better gear to take on harder missions. It's not unlike Monster Hunter in a lot of ways, which might be why it never really clicked with me. I respect what it tried to do, but I just didn't spend a lot of time with it because it feels shallow and lonely in single player, but multiplayer is too complicated to get working. But it created a strong world that some other games would be set in, so it still is a win in my book. Ring of Fates kind of makes me think of what the original Crystal Chronicles would be without the multiplayer focus or the requirement of carrying a chalice around everywhere to avoid damage. And it's a better game because of both of those things. As a more solo adventure, though still with a traditional party system, the game can focus more on single-player exploration and platforming, with light puzzle solving and a slightly more dynamic battle system than its GameCube predecessor. It's still a simple button masher, but there's at least a little more variety in how you can take down enemies. The unique magic system from the previous game is also back here, and still is clunky, as you stand still and move a reticle around the field to aim your magic, but it's not as easy to combo it with your companions because they're computer controlled and kind of dumb. The best option is to lock the reticle and then swap characters and move their magic into place, but it doesn't feel great and is really slow and is rarely worth using outside of when it's required for puzzles. Each party member does have a special ability though that helps mix up exploration by making platforms visible across a gap, for example, and they also have different weapons that might be better for some enemy types than others. The story presentation is also pretty impressive for the Nintendo DS, with nicely detailed character models and a decent amount of voice-acted cutscenes. It shares enough in common with its namesake to still feel like a Crystal Chronicles game, but it also sets itself apart as a single-player narrative adventure rather than a more mission-based and gimmicky multiplayer game that I'm pretty sure was just made to sell GBA link cables. To me, at least, it's also probably the best of this sub-series, though it's not a high bar. This is another entry similar to the last one, with some quirks because it was released on both the DS and Wii, and featured cross-play multiplayer between them. While it's similar to the GameCube game, it's luckily a lot easier to get the multiplayer working because of the online functionality, but the novelty still wore off quickly when you realized there's not actually much substance to the game. It looks and plays a lot like the previous DS game, but instead of featuring original party members and a fairly deep narrative story, most of the personality is stripped out as you create a custom party or play with friends online, and mostly just complete repetitive missions together without much of a story to tie it all together. The combat is about the same, though the controls are a little less reliant on the touchscreen due to also being a Wii game and needing button inputs for every action. Maybe if you had a group to play this together with during its prime, it'd be better, but considering it didn't sell that well, I'm guessing it was still just a shallow novelty that most people fell off of quickly. It's a fine companion to Ring of Fates if you want more of that gameplay, but it definitely feels like a lifeless follow-up during a time when they were really trying to capitalize on the Crystal Chronicles branding. Around this time, there was also the pair of WiiWare games called My Life as a King and My Life as a Dark Lord, but I've never played them and can't really track down digital-only Wii titles anymore, so they don't get anything more than a mention. But this subseries really ran the gamut of different game genres. This is most true with the last and most ambitious title. Crystal Bearers takes the interesting world established from the other games and turns it into a point-and-grab waggle-fest for the Wii, devoid of almost all RPG elements. I can see the appeal here of wanting to make a more epic, cinematic adventure game set in this now well-established universe, but putting it on the Wii was a huge mistake. You have little to no camera control, and nearly every interaction just involves pointing the Wii remote cursor at a glowing thing and flinging that thing at another thing. Whether it's using a piece of level geometry to throw a switch, flinging an enemy at another enemy to damage them both, or just yanking on a door to open it. To say the system is shallow is an understatement. There's a slight upgrade system with new gear and more health, and the actual missions are visually interesting with characters that mostly have a lot of personality, but the main character is a wet blanket with nothing going on who just runs through the game using one of those sticky hand things from the arcade as his only weapon. It's weird. The DS games might have been a little limited in scope, but at least they had more going on mechanically. This game tried to flesh out the world and story, but forgot to actually build interesting gameplay to go with it. Probably the other high-profile subseries is the Tactics games, though they're a bit more similar to each other, so I don't need to spend as much time on the differences between them, luckily. Tactics games in general have never really been my forte, but I did put a lot of time into this series growing up. I think it's kind of like Explorers, where I was willing to give it a pass because of the Final Fantasy branding, but I mostly just liked how it handled the job system and learning new abilities using job points you earn from fighting well in battles. The story was also interesting, but it was pretty over-serious and a lot of reading, and as a kid I just skipped through a lot of it. I do remember some of the highlights with like Ramza and all that, but yeah. And now as an adult, I'm kind of just tired of stories about war, so I still skip through a lot of it. But if you've played other Tactics games, you know how this one plays. Dialogue-heavy cutscenes give the story between battles, and then you pick a location on the map to start the next mission, place your party members on the grid, and take turns moving around the grid to grab treasure, attack enemies, or strategically place yourself to guard weak teammates. It admittedly doesn't do anything revolutionary. Even by the PS1 era, there had been a lot of strategy RPGs, though not as many had actually made it overseas. Looking at you, Fire Emblem series. But this game did do some neat things with the Final Fantasy branding. Like I said, the job system is well implemented, including things like Summoner, that had some impressively animated summons using a mix of 2D sprites and 3D effects. It also had some cool versions of classic characters like Chocobos and Bombs, rendered in a unique art style. And a few cameo characters could be recruited to your team if you met special conditions, like Cloud, who seems very confused how he got there. Overall, this game holds up as one of the old-time classics of the genre, even if it's not my favorite. The remake is better though, even if it's trapped on PSP and mobile phones. I have it on my phone though, and as a tactical RPG, it's not too bad to control with the touchscreen. Just saying. Now this game was my jam as a kid. I probably spent more time with it than just about any other game I owned, which admittedly wasn't very many of them. It does some things better than its predecessor, like I enjoy the cute but still deep story more, and I prefer this Evil Ice setting with a diverse roster of playable races over the mostly human cast of Tactics, but it also does some things worse. Obviously, as a GBA game, it looks a lot different. I think the art style still holds up well, but battlefields are laid out a little differently because of the lack of camera control, and a lot of the animations are simpler. Plus, the sprites can get a little lost in the environment sometimes, to the point where I'd take a surprise attack from someone I didn't see because of the small unlit screen of the original GBA. Obviously, emulation mitigates a lot of that, but it was still a problem back then. I'm also not as big of a fan of how you unlock new jobs and abilities. It uses a similar system as Final Fantasy IX, which is one of my least favorite things about that game too, where you have abilities tied to equipment and unlock them through points earned while wearing that equipment. And jobs are unlocked by learning a certain number of abilities for that job. But that, mixed with the fact that only certain races can learn certain jobs, means it's also hard to even know what job requirements are until you get access to see which ones are available for that character. Some of it makes sense, like the new job Moogle Knight obviously would only be available for the Moogle, but it's still just a much harder system to keep track of and makes characters feel like an extension of their race rather than unique characters on their own. This game's presentation is also pretty similar to its sequel, so let's move on for now. Yeah, despite being on the DS, you'd be hard-pressed to see much difference graphically between this and its predecessor. There's some more detailed effects and slightly fancier animations, but for the most part it still feels like it could have been a last generation game, probably because it started life as a GBA sequel. Even the second screen is all but worthless. The added scale of summon monsters is pretty neat, and yeah, it's nice to have a reminder of the forbidden actions on screen, which is something I didn't touch on before because I hate the judge system and tend to ignore it most of the time unless the rewards are worth it. But I feel like they could have used the extra power of the DS to make this game more like the original Tactics, especially since some other tactical RPGs on the system use a similar 2D, 3D graphics hybrid style to that game. But yeah, this one plays out very similar to the last one, with a lot of the same jobs, the same systems to unlock jobs, even really similar mission structures that mostly just give you materials to obtain rare equipment for better abilities. Aside from a few new mission types and a bit of a larger scope to the map, it's honestly pretty uninspired, with a story that's a lot less interesting than its predecessor. One of my favorite things about the first Tactics Advance game is its lighthearted but still surprisingly heartfelt story about a group of kids who get sucked into a storybook world. You follow the main character, who's kind of an everyman, but the main villain is the misunderstood kid that gets bullied by the other kids. So while you're trying to get back to the real world, this kid is actively fighting to keep everyone in the storybook because he actually feels like he belongs in the fantasy world. It's a tragic and relatable story for any shut-in nerd like me, and it makes for a compelling villain story because he's not inherently evil, he just doesn't want to go back home. I recently covered Link's Awakening from my Zeldaverse perspective, and it makes me think of like if Marin found out Link's quest would resolve with her world going away, so she teamed up with a Nightmare and the Windfish Egg to stop him from destroying her home, or something. Meanwhile, the story of this second game has very similar beats of a kid getting sucked into a storybook world, but he's left with an empty book that fills in as he adventures, implying he's basically the author of the story. But it's not an interesting story, ironically. It's neat that it's also set in Evil Ice and even features some cameos from Final Fantasy XII characters like Vaughn and Pinelo, but the Evil Ice setting is the most interesting thing about the game, and even that's portrayed better in other Evil Ice games like Final Fantasy XII itself and the previous Tactics game. Though, on a side note, I don't know why the original Tactics claims to be in the Evil Ice Alliance. It's a totally different world from those more fantastical games. Next up is a probably brief look at the weird set of fighting games in the Final Fantasy series. And no, I don't mean Ehrgeiz. I don't know how to say that, but I left that game off on purpose. So I'm not the biggest fan of the Dissidia series. Something about the mechanics just never really clicked with me. But I don't think anyone would deny that this pair of games are very impressive for the PSP. Like, that little handheld had some beefy games, but they all felt like they had to make some sacrifices to fit the format. But Dissidia is a visually impressive and mechanically complex fighting game with a lot of great cinematics, special effects, and tons of content, especially for a fighting game. Basically, it's like an Elseworlds story where a collection of main heroes and villains from the first 13 games duke it out in large battlefields. The Final Fantasy series was changing a lot around this time, from the more cinematic presentation of the PS2 and PS3 titles, to the more action-focused spin-offs like Dirge of Cerberus, to the first big-screen movies, including the inspiration for this game, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. The way that movie presented battles was wild and unrealistic, but looked really cool, with a lot of air dashes, flashy attacks, and over-the-top animations. So, when it came time to make an actual Final Fantasy fighting game, the team set out to recreate that cinematic combat style, but make it playable. They dabbled with that before in the Kingdom Hearts games, but that's kind of its own thing. They wanted to bring it to Final Fantasy specifically. And while I never totally got a feel for how to juggle the Brave and HP attack system to succeed, it is really cool in theory, at least. Essentially, you build up what are called Brave attacks to get big number, which is both a representation of your attack and defense power. And then, when you use an HP attack, it basically expends that amount of Brave and lowers the number, leaving you open to follow-up attacks from the enemy. The goal is to get the enemy's HP low enough that you can take them out with your amount of built-up Brave on their HP. Like I said, it's a little confusing, and I'm not good at explaining it. And there's also a lot of mechanics to this game that I don't have time to get into, but it's fun to fly around the stages initiating flashy attacks against other iconic characters. Now, I did say this is 2 games on the PSP, but the quote-unquote sequel, Dissidia 012, basically includes all the content from the original and more, so I'm really only talking about that one, but both play similarly enough. 012, I guess I'll call it, just adds more characters, including support characters with cameo abilities to unleash, and a much more in-depth story mode with a full world map to explore. The story in both versions is multiversal nonsense, as I'm sure you'd expect from a concept like this, but it is nicely voice acted, even if a lot of the cutscenes are just 3D rendered characters talking at each other in a void. Like I said, this is beefy content for the PSP, considering how good it all looks too. And once you add in full RPG-style character customization with better gear, alternate costumes, and more, you have an impressive game that I'm just not very good at, but I respect its ambition at least. Fighting games just really aren't my thing. So this is basically a modern interpretation of the same mechanics, but it's arguably not as good, despite looking amazing and featuring a ton more characters and even summon monsters. The increased roster is part of the problem though, as it's been turned into a 3v3 fighter rather than the 1v1 of the original, and it just makes the matches a little messy to keep track of. I also don't feel like the characters have as much depth as they did before, maybe because they needed to give enough moves to all of the characters they added. Though it also means if you're not the best at the game, you have 2 other characters to help out, which means that I had a little more success playing it, but it just doesn't feel as good to play. It's more grounded, with the flying around the field limited to a dashing meter, and a lot of the character customization has been removed. The flashy attack animations are still impressive, and the addition of full summon attacks are great, but it all just seems a bit more hollow this time. I don't know how to explain it. This game started as an arcade title before being ported to home consoles as a fairly microtransaction-heavy title with a ton of purchasable characters, costumes, and more. Maybe that's why it feels hollow. It's a modern game where a lot of the content is locked away as paid DLC. But the story mode is also lacking compared to its smaller PSP entry, and it just generally has a lot less to do. It's mostly just an online-focused fighting game, which is fine, it still plays well, but I'd love to see a new game with the ambitious content of the PSP games, but that graphically holds up like NT. But this video isn't about speculation. Let's move on.
This video is brought to you by Final Fantasy VII The Second Soldier, the not anticipated follow-up to the critical failure Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier. We listened to fan feedback and removed all the awful Battle Royale gameplay, so now the loot boxes can be front and center. If you're feeling lucky, pre-register now for a special first season prize highlighting everyone's favorite character, Kate Oh, the game's already canceled? Yeah, that checks out.
Last and least, we have a section I'd like to call Final Fantasy spin-offs that actually belong to other series. Because why not? Let's end this list with games that aren't even technically Final Fantasy games. If you know this game at all, you probably know it as Adventure of Mana, the 3D remake of this Game Boy classic. Or maybe as Sword of Mana for the GBA, though that's technically a different game that just borrows some plot points from this one. That's right, despite the Final Fantasy branding, this is actually the first game in the Mana series. Many people say Secret of Mana is first, because it's the first entry released with the Mana name, but this game came out first, and the story is all about the series staple Mana Tree. It does also feature a few Final Fantasy staples like the Chocobo, but you could just consider that a cameo, like how Link and Samus show up in Mario RPG. The gameplay is full-on Mana, which is to say action-adventure, as you slash enemies in real time and explore the world map looking for caves or towns that provide story progress. If anything, it's more Zelda than Final Fantasy, since you collect new gear throughout the game that can open up new paths, though it's much less complex than anything from the Zelda series. I'm not personally the biggest fan of this game, and never even played the actual Adventure of Mana remake because I heard it was just kind of janky since it came out on mobile first. But it's pretty advanced for the Game Boy at the time, and is a strong start for a mostly great but underrated series. Side note, I can't wait for Visions of Mana later this year. It's been too long since the Mana series has gotten some love. Though I hope it's actually good. I'm not going to spend long on each of these games because I didn't actually enjoy playing them, but this trio of Legend games are actually the first 3 entries in the Saga series. But when they were released in English, the localization dubbed them Final Fantasy instead for brand recognition. I guess Square figured English audiences didn't care about an RPG series that wasn't Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, which, again, probably fair. The games have all since been remade with their Saga branding, though none of the remakes came to English either and are only playable now thanks to the hard work of fan translators. The first one was on the WonderSwan, with a lot of much needed quality of life improvements because that game is tough, to say the least. It drops you in with minimal story and no direction or money, and healing your only character to start is surprisingly expensive, so the heavy-hitting enemies make it a chore to make progress. The second game fares quite a bit better, and its remake is on the DS, which suits the more advanced presentation. The story here is still kind of a mess, but your custom-created main character is on the search for his dad, which is extra amusing depending on which species you choose during creation, because in my case, a robot is tracking down his seemingly human biological dad. The same goes for your other party members, like a dragon having a fairy for a mother. They're also assisted by a teacher that's like an alien or something. I don't have a lot of experience with the Saga series in general, but I haven't seen this amount of interspecies mingling since Shrek 2. Is it normal? Anyway, the third game is a pretty major step up in the presentation department, even on the Game Boy. Though the story is still a little hard to follow, as you're kind of thrown into a whole time travel plot, and none of the mechanics are explained in-game, though I'm sure they're in the manual. The remake of this one is also on the DS, but it was a lot more drastically changed and updated to match the ambition of its concept. But again, it never made it to English, so thank your local fan translator for making it playable. It also explains the concept of the different species better, though, as you can basically transform party members using parts dropped by defeated enemies. I still don't really know what any of them do, but it's a unique mechanic that is very much not Final Fantasy. So yeah, much like they were doing with the mainline series numbering around this time, the Final Fantasy devs made some weird choices by rebranding these games, since they share almost nothing with the rest of the series, aside from turn-based combat. But hey, Adventure didn't even have that, so I guess it's progress. So this one is kind of a loose definition of not a Final Fantasy game, because it totally is. It's got the job system, the 4 Warriors of Light, the classic magic system, all of that. But it's also been on record as essentially the game that created the Bravely Default series, and it feels just as much like those games as it does Final Fantasy. See, the battle system is fairly simple, with very limited spell points in place of MP, and an action point system for initiating commands and traditional turn-based battles. The Bravely Default inspiration, though, comes from the boost system, which basically causes the player to give up their turn in favor of more AP the next turn. Very similar to the Brave and Default system, where you can either deplete extra actions and lose a future turn, or default on your current turn to do more the next turn. The art style is also firmly between the Final Fantasy IV 3D remake and what would end up being Bravely Default for the 3DS, which has a little more, graphical power. The job system even feels like inspiration, as it's called the Crown system and is symbolized by different hats. Bravely Default features more traditional job transformations, but those outfits are much more ridiculous than most of what's in Final Fantasy, and some of these crowns look closer to the Bravely Default transformations. Plus, the fact that that series features a more classic exploration style with maze-like dungeons and towns with shops and side quests, compared to Final Fantasy at the time having evolved into something more cinematic and narrative-focused. 4 Heroes of Light, being a throwback to classic Final Fantasy, set it up to be its own thing. That thing becoming Bravely Default rather than its own sequel. So yeah, this wasn't like the others where it had a different series name in Japan and they just branded it as Final Fantasy in America, but looking back, it is just as much the prototype for the Bravely Default series as it is a throwback to classic Final Fantasy. Whew. That's basically every Final Fantasy spin-off title ever made. Anything that's missing is just because it fell within one of the categories I established up top, or a rare case of not really having anything to say about a game because I don't know anything about it. There are also, unfortunately, a few titles that have been lost to time, but honestly, this is already probably the most ambitious video I've produced, so I'm perfectly content with leaving a few things off. Even a lot of the mobile games and stuff are still represented here, I just didn't actually critique them. But yeah, is there a game that stood out to you most? Any you didn't know about? Any you want me to cover more in depth? Let me know in the comments below. I'm going to keep this outro short because the rest of the video is so long, but if you want more of my content, you're currently on my channel, so you know what to do in the places. I don't know where it is. But anyway, whoo boy, there's a lot of games in this series called Final Fantasy. Hey, Inslate Zero here. I gotta let y'all know that you might not see me for a little bit. Not really sure yet. I've got a trip to Europe coming up and then a fairly serious surgery when I get back, so we'll see how I'm feeling over the next few months. But that's why I wanted this supersized video out in the meantime. Whenever I'm back, I'll probably either be covering some travel vlogs from my trip or something else random while I work on a few fresh replays of Ocarina of Time. It's only fair I cover the normal version and Master Quest run for the retrospective video, which will take some time. I am planning on streaming the Master Quest run at least, so maybe I'll see you over on Twitch when that happens.